Hello, everyone. My name is Brian. You can call me Dr. Erp or Brian if you like. I'll be teaching this course asynchronously, so you'll see some videos like this from me about once a week. Sometimes it'll be a video I've recorded for these purposes. Other times it'll be a video that has already been recorded but relates to the reading, and so you'll see me in various different outfits and ages and phases and so forth throughout the course of what's coming. In this lecture, I just want to give you an overview of the syllabus, basically, and tell you some general themes in the course that I want to address, and maybe some lessons that I hope you'll take from our conversations throughout the week, the readings, and the assignments. One thing to point out about the syllabus is just that it's recently updated. As I was going through and listing the lessons for each week and getting everything synced up with the website, I realized in some cases that I had too many readings, or that the due date needed to be adjusted in order to be more reasonable given the available time frames. So do make sure that you're looking at the most recent version of the syllabus, which should just be up in the left-hand corner of the platform under the syllabus tab. And I think that I've gone and synced it with everything else in the site. So everything should be synced with everything else. But in case there are discrepancies, you'll want to favor the syllabus up in the left-hand corner. What else shall I say? My background, as I said in my introductory notes, is in philosophy and bioethics and psychology. I've helped to create a field called experimental philosophical bioethics, which is just an emerging phenomenon, but there are more and more papers coming out every year that really combine the sorts of analytical approaches and research methods associated with, say, experimental psychology with the normative questions that we ask as bioethicists. So I have a background in scientific training, how to conduct scientific studies, to test hypotheses and try to get an accurate description of the world in one way or another, as well as in moral philosophy and bioethics and so forth. So a big theme of this course is going to be what exactly is the relationship between these things. If we're resting an empirical argument on a certain set of findings that have come out in the medical literature, let's say, then we need to be well equipped to understand how well those findings support the empirical claims that we're making. But then we also have to think about whether the empirical claims that we're making are ones that we want to rest an ethical argument on top of. And partly what you're going to see through this course is that getting a really tight handle on what we know about especially contested areas of medical or scientific research, sufficient to balance a normative argument on specific empirical claims, is at the very least more difficult than I think many bioethicists often assume. I think there's often a kind of naive appeal to some studies that came out in the New England Journal of Medicine last week, and they look pretty good, and so you sort of cite those or take them for granted to then build your ethical argument. But what we're going to be doing in this course is figuring out how to take a really critical lens to the published scientific literature. And we're going to do it not just by looking at particular studies and figuring out how to pick them apart, but by stepping back and thinking historically, how does science work as an institution? How do the sociological factors that go into the actual conduct of science leave room for personal bias, for institutional bias, for cultural bias, and so forth? So that scientists who are doing their best may nevertheless be incentivized by these social structures and by biases that they're not necessarily aware of to conduct research that in the first place may not replicate. So it might not be that the findings are robust, or it might be that the findings have limited relevance for generalizing to another group or generalizing outside the context of the study itself, much less relevance for particular ethical arguments that you may want to raise. So in a broad kind of 10,000 foot level way, that's what this course is going to be about. Understanding science as an institution, as a social practice, understanding how to actually analytically go in there and identify what kinds of evidence we have for different sorts of claims and what the limits are of our ability to generalize from evidence generated in a given study to wider empirical spheres, and then getting from empirical spheres of discussion into normative or ethical spheres of discussion. And so that's sort of the scope of things. I'm just going to click over to the syllabus to scroll through and see whether there's anything that I want to mention in particular so that we're all on the same page. So The course is Research Methods in Bioethics. I'm going to conceive of that in two ways. One research method approach is to figure out how to do research with published empirical studies. So if I'm a bioethicist and I'm writing about abortion or vaccines or whatever it is, I have to figure out what kind of evidence is credible or reliable if I'm going to bother to cite it in any of my papers. Now, I could do some sort of purely theoretical exercise and say, assume for the sake of argument there's a pill that has such and so effects. But if I'm talking about anything actual, like an actual pill or an actual vaccine or medical complications associated with certain types of surgeries or something like that, I need to constrain my arguments as best as I can by what I reasonably know about what's empirically true about the phenomenon in question. And so that's going to require an ability to critically read, assess, pick apart, and think through the design and the methods and the materials of the kinds of studies that you'll read in medical journals. The other way that the course is about research methods is if you're a bioethicist who wants to conduct research. Now, some of you I know have a scientific background or a medical background. Others of you might be coming into bioethics from a different angle. But there's this exciting so-called empirical turn within bioethics where more and more bioethicists who are interested in normative questions, moral questions, questions about what should be the case, what's ethically appropriate or inappropriate, are interested in actually conducting some of their own studies, designing studies, collecting data, analyzing the data, and then trying to see whether they can learn anything from what they themselves have conducted with respect to, for example, how it is that different stakeholders in practice make moral judgments about certain contentious issues. And we'll look at some examples of that. So your final project will be one of two options. You'll be able to either do a critique of a study, and I'll post one or two study options at the end of the course that you can choose to do a critique of. Learning from the lessons that we've employed over the course of the lessons of the course. And then the other option will be to do a study proposal using a pre-registration form, and I'll explain what that is and why that's important. But it's basically a formalized way of setting out what you plan to study, what your hypotheses are, how you would test those hypotheses, what measures you would actually use, what your sampling plan is, roughly what the analysis is that you plan to do, and so forth. So I'll get into all of that over the course of the next couple of weeks. But that's how I'm conceiving of research methods in bioethics in both of those senses I just mentioned. What else? I have a section at the beginning of the syllabus that says, please read carefully. And one point just to emphasize is that instead of trying to do scattershot coverage of a whole wide range of issues in bioethics, I'm going to be focusing pretty specifically on a very contentious issue of bioethics that's a current hot topic, and that has to do with body modifications, and in particular genital modifications, primarily of young people. Now, the most salient discourse in this space has to do probably with modifications for gender identity among transgender identified teenagers. And for the most part, we won't be getting too far into those particular debates. Rather, we'll be looking at female, male, and intersex forms of genital modification, surgeries basically, or in some cases ritual practices, that are primarily performed on people for whom there's very little doubt whether they can consent. So it's basically a question of how shall we reason about the limits of what parents or doctors may do when it comes to the embodiment of somebody who can't for themselves authorize the procedure. Should we make judgments based on how harmful we think the procedure is? Should we make judgments based on how beneficial we think it is? Should we make judgments based on how important it is to the parents? And then we'll see in this very difficult and contentious space, normatively speaking, how people will often kind of grab at empirical claims to bolster one argument or the other. And so we'll need to break down how that will happen in particular cases. So these topics are very heated. They're very sensitive. They touch on people's lives. They touch on people's bodies and identities and so forth. And so I'm going to try to ease us into the topics in such a way that we're prepared to discuss them in as sensitive and a respectful way as they deserve. I'll also say that, I've published a lot on these topics, on the interface of these different kinds of genital modification procedures, partly because they touch on so many issues that are central to bioethics. So they touch on issues of bodily integrity, they touch on issues of consent and autonomy, they touch on issues of beneficence, on proxy decision making, on substituted judgments, and then they touch on broader issues of political theory and multiculturalism and religion and all sorts of things that are really at the heart of bioethics, all of which are swirling around this particular set of topics that tend to be very emotive. They tend to inspire sometimes defensiveness, sometimes anger, sometimes passion that goes beyond what the person really knows about the topic. So we need to be aware of that together as a class, and that's why I've written this whole speech at the beginning of the syllabus, suggesting that although these are topics that will tend to inspire strong feelings, we owe it to each other to recognize the diversity of backgrounds among your fellow students, the diversity of perspectives that people might be bringing to these topics just from their own background or from the reading or research that they've done. And so rather than thinking that we already know what the answer is, a major lesson of this course and what a lot of the grading will be about is how well we can demonstrate a posture of open-mindedness, of curiosity, of intellectual humility, of ethical humility. As we'll see, these topics are just extremely complicated, more so than is often apparent in, say, public discussions or what you'll read in the newspaper or even what you might get from a medical society memo or something like that. When you really dig into these things, as I've been doing for the last 10 years, you start to see that this is really a deep thicket. And so what we need is intelligent, responsible, thoughtful, sensitive people to bring their reasoning and moral instincts to bear on these questions so that as a society we can work through what the implications should be and what our ethical stance should be. The final point to make about that is that although I've published a lot on these topics and my set of arguments are pretty easy to find, it shouldn't be too hard to discover generally how I think about these questions. There's no expectation at all that you'll agree with my substantive points that I've put forward in the literature. There are a couple of cases where I've included some of my own work, but for the most part, I've tried to leave the papers to others. And so I just want to be clear. If you find that you want to reach a conclusion that's vastly different from one that I may have supported in my own writing, that's totally fine. I welcome constructive debate and discussion. I certainly don't expect any kind of pro forma agreement with me, and you won't get any points for agreeing with me. You'll only get points for representing your point of view in a rigorous and logical and appropriately humble and inquisitive kind of a way. And I just need to be explicit about that, given how much I've done on this particular topic myself. So that might be just about what I wanted to say. The first couple of weeks are going to be talking about science as an institution. Then we're going to start talking a little bit more about ethnography and qualitative research, and that's where we'll get substantively into questions of intersex surgeries, female genital cutting, or as it's sometimes called female genital mutilation, or as it's sometimes called female circumcision, and then male genital cutting or male circumcision, and how these different kinds of genital modifications are different from each other in empirical and moral ways, as well as potentially overlapping in certain ways, will be something we'll start to make sense of by week 3, basically. And then in weeks 4 and 5 and 6, we'll be pursuing the thread of those particular topics in terms of the substance of the material that the papers are covering, but we'll be looking at many different research methods. We'll be looking at many different approaches and perspectives to try to get an interdisciplinary and intermethodological perspective on these, as I say, incredibly complex and contentious topics. Discussion forums are going to be the main part of this course, apart from the assignment. And so there will be 3 questions each week, and you should try to respond to each one with about 200 to 300 words. The point is not to be verbose, it's to be concise. And while you're being concise, to be, as I've mentioned now a couple of times, as sensitive and as humble as the material requires, anticipating that there are going to be people who have different positions from you, who have different emotions to deal with, who may have quite a lot that they're dealing with or that they may want to say. And so each of us needs to triangulate our perspective a bit and make sure that we're not just hammering one position or defending one cause, but being open-minded to the range of perspectives that will undoubtedly arise in these discussions. And again, a major part of the grading, not that it should all be about grading, is going to be about the sensitiveness with which you comport yourself in any kinds of exchanges with your classmates and with me, I suppose. So in addition to answering those 3 questions, in past years they've requested that you respond to 5 of your classmates' posts. I've changed that to 3 of your classmates' posts. I don't think that you necessarily need to do 5 or more, but you're welcome to respond to as many as you like to. And then we have the concluding assignment here. And the grades, again, not my main interest, but for all sorts of reasons, there's got to be some grades. And so the way it breaks down is there will be 50% for the weekly reading responses. So as I've suggested, that's a major part of the course. The draft proposal for peer review, again, it's just a matter of respect to your fellow classmates. Please make sure that the draft of your proposal or your critique are going to be worth the time that your classmates spend giving you critiques and feedback on it, so that over the remaining 2 weeks of the course you'll be able to incorporate their feedback. But if you just send them something that's barely put together and absolutely sketchy, then it just won't be a respectful use of their time. So I'll leave that to you to decide about. And I'll have given you some examples of what I consider to be a good critique if you're going to do a methodological critique, and I'll give you some pointers on what would be a good proposal. And if you have any questions about either of those things at any point as you're working on them, just feel free to, I would say, email me, or maybe we should try to keep the discussion within the website as much as possible, just so that we can learn from each other's responses. So maybe I'll direct you to post questions in like a public discussion place or community forum or something like that. And then if I respond to you, I'm responding to everyone so that we can all be on the same page about whatever your question might have been in any individual case. If anybody has any needs for accommodation of any kind, please let me know. For example, somebody messaged me to say I think they'll be at a wedding on a given class, and can they submit their questions and their responses to the questions in advance? And please feel free to email me with any such thing. I certainly try to be reasonable in accommodating any such needs. I myself just had to go to a funeral, and I seem to have caught COVID during that journey. So I know these sorts of things arise, and I'm not going to hold you to a higher standard than I hold myself about either participating or taking an extension if one is needed. For late work, if you are in such a situation and you can anticipate more than 24 hours ahead of the deadline that you're probably not going to make it, please let me know, and we'll work out whatever is the next reasonable deadline. But if you don't let me know and you just miss the deadline, then I'll have to subtract some points with each passing day. But just do let me know as a matter of courtesy to me, so that I know whether to be waiting up at midnight for your submission. Final thing to say here maybe is you shouldn't use Chatbot GPT. Maybe many of you have heard about this new AI that allows you to submit prompts, and then it will basically write up an answer for you. And for our purposes, that would count as an instance of plagiarism. You'll be passing off the work not necessarily of another human being, but of another entity as your own. I think there are probably some valid ways to use Chatbot GPT or other such programs in the context of academic writing, maybe to help you formulate a draft of something, to get your ideas straight. There's possibly some ways to do it, but just make sure that whatever you submit to the forums, for example, is your own writing and isn't copied and pasted from another program. I'm sure there's going to be some fancy technology to detect violations of this at some point. There probably aren't now, so this is just an honor code thing. Please make sure you're doing your own writing for the community forums. And that's it. That's what I have for the syllabus. So I hope this has been helpful to just give you a sense of how I'm thinking of the course, what basically we'll be talking about. Again, controversial subject matter, and there's no getting around that. That's what bioethics is about. You have to forgive me for my COVID symptoms here. Bioethics is a field where things that are genuinely ethically contentious have to be dealt with. It's not a field where there's just some obvious right answer and we go out and promulgate the right answer. Maybe there's some cases like that where there's something approaching a consensus in the field of bioethics. The Tuskegee syphilis experiments, which were prompting some of the early developments in the field, are more or less a matter of consensus, although I've seen some scholarship suggesting that some of the initial claims were inaccurate or insufficiently well contextualized or something like that. So even with things that look like they're open and shut, there can sometimes be disagreement at the margins. But a lot of what happens in bioethics is genuine moral disagreement between different stakeholders. You can take, for example, debates happening about abortion. You have some people for whom it is just obvious and clear and politically important that one set of arguments runs through. And it may seem to them and to others who share their perspective that nothing could be more urgent, nothing could be more obvious than the correctness of that view. And although there may be people with disingenuous trolling-like attitudes on different sides of complex debates, there's surely also some others who have, sincerely motivated and genuinely held contrary positions. And, a lot is at stake, and a lot is personally at stake for different people who engage in those debates. And nevertheless, the only way as a polity and as a society we're going to work through some of the most challenging debates that may cut to the core of our metaphysics, our sense of identity in the world, our politics, whether we feel safe in our own bodies, is to try to figure out how to talk about them respectfully and to acknowledge when others disagree with us in good faith and not attack each other's character or anything like that. So I trust that all of you will rise to the challenge of talking about topics that touch on sex and gender and race and identity and religion and colonialism, and all manner of extremely difficult topics. We're going to learn a lot in this course. I'm sure I'm going to learn from you. I don't have it all worked out, even though I've been thinking about these topics for a long time. So I'm hoping this will be an exchange and not just me pontificating from behind my computer screen here. So I look forward to your feedback throughout the course. If you have questions or concerns that you want to raise at any time, please feel free to do so. And I'll leave it there so you can get to your reading and whatever else you have going on this week. But I look forward to engaging with you in some format or the other over the next 10 weeks. And thanks for your time.